Well, welcome everybody to our Wednesday CAF webinar. And as you may have noticed, Nancy is not here today. She is swimming in the Azores right now, so she's not going to be here for this particular presentation. But I'm very excited to be part of it. And I have with me today Gilbert in the B29 hat, who works for the CAF as well in marketing, and he's going to be helping field questions that are coming in from you guys. And then we have our star of the show today, which is Brad Pilgrim. And I'm really excited about this, and the reason is because since we started this webinar series, we realized that we have these great CAF stories and no recording of them. So we've asked Brad to come and help record some of these great CAF stories, and Brad, being our unofficial but hope to be soon official CAF historian, has what we call grown-up CAF. So Brad has a long history with airplanes. He's been a CAF cadet, grown up in the hangar. He's seen lots of things. He was the B-29 crew chief on Fifi for a while. In his career path, he worked for the US Air Force as the Loadmaster on the C-130 and the C-17. So he's seen some things there too. And he currently works for the Cavanaugh Flight Museum in Addison, Texas. So welcome, Brad, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Nice to be here. I
hope I'm to start off, when did you how did you get started with the CAF? Let's start there.
I got started, my first memory of the CAF was in the early 70s, around 1970, well, mid to late 70s, around 77, 78. Where I lived out in Snyder in West Texas, there's 2 Air Force bases within 90 miles, and they always had air shows every year, so there's always warbirds there. And so that's where I first heard of the CAF, and then we started going to Harlingen for the air show around that time. And for some reason in 1984, when I was 11 years old, the light kind of, flashed on. All of a sudden, I decided old airplanes is all I cared about anymore, and just pretty much the same way I am now. And so I joined the CAF as an associate member when I was 11 years old. And that's, before the cadet program. We didn't really have the cadet program when I was a kid, and we lived so far from a CAF unit, it wouldn't have mattered. But I just learned about the CAF through going to air shows and all that. And at the time, the Collins Foundation and all these other groups that fly airplanes and do things with warbirds, none of them really existed. And there were very few, Kermit Weeks wasn't collecting airplanes and stuff like that. There was the CAF, and then there was the Planes of Fame out in California. And that was about it as far as warbirds went. There's a couple of owners that had 10 or 12 planes, but nothing like today where you've got, like in our case at Cavanaugh, where we've got 75 or 80 airplanes. That kind of stuff didn't exist. So the CAF was the only game in town. And so that's kind of, by virtue of that, that's how I got involved with the CAF. They were the only place to get involved. I did kind of find that a lot of times back then, some of the older guys didn't always have time for a little kid, I guess is the easiest way to say it. And I probably was a pain in the butt. But fortunately, over in Breckenridge, which was 100 miles to the other side of town from us, CAF members, Howard Pardue and Bill Arnott, guys like that, they all lived there. And they were all, the Big Iron Squadron of the West Texas Wing was there at the time. And those guys really kind of just let me be there. They kind of let me belong, I guess. And that was where I kind of really got involved. And then over the years, the Air Force got in the way. I didn't live in Texas most of the time and flew 300 days a year while I was in the military. And so I didn't have a lot of time to really get involved until, I guess, about the time we did the engine change on Fifi is when I got involved in the day-to-day. I was commuting from South Carolina to Midland. When I wasn't flying for the Air Force, I would fly out on Continental Airlines to go work on Fifi. Spent a whole lot of money that I didn't have and had no way of getting at that time, but I did it anyway because I knew that was the only way I could be involved. Then after I retired and we ended up back in Texas, I've just been involved ever since and hope to stay involved as long as I possibly can.
Awesome, we do too. All right, Gilbert, do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah.
We're not quite seeing the next slide yet, but I'll ask my question anyway. There's a rumor that the CAF had lots of P-47s. What's the story with the P-47?
The P-47 Thunderbolts, is that what you're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there in 1969, a man named Ed Jurist, who was a big early CAF supporter, he owned a company called the Vintage Aircraft Company out in Nyack, New York. And Ed and David Talashay were partners in a lot of stuff. You know, Dave's a famous warbird collector. They would go all over the world and bring back airplanes. We have them to thank for a lot of the warbirds that are surviving today. Well, Ed Jurist found these 6 Thunderbolts in Peru, and he bought them all and had them all shipped to Breville, Texas, which was not far from the CAF, and then had them trucked up to headquarters. And the CAF entered into a contract with him to reassemble and operate the airplanes. And the idea was the CAF was going to try to buy a few of them, and they hoped to form a Thunderbolt squadron. And, you know, each airplane is going to be sponsored by a couple of guys or whatever. It never really worked out that way. The CAF had their own Thunderbolt, the one that we still have now, the N model. We got that in 1963. Dick Disney flew it up from Nicaragua. And when these airplanes all showed up, the CAF Thunderbolt was in Florida being restored. So these airplanes were never actually the CAFs. That's a common misconception, because back in the 60s and early 70s, a lot of airplanes were kind of leased to the CAF. And the way they kind of did sponsorships back then was, if you brought a Mustang and you owned a Mustang and you let the CAF buy part of that Mustang, then it became a CAF airplane on paper for ownership reasons, for tax reasons and stuff like that. That's kind of what happened to these Thunderbolts. The CAF never owned them. They actually operated them for about 2 years off and on. And Ed Jurist sold all of them to Dave Talashay, and then they've all been sold on since then. As hard as we tried to acquire them, they were never ours. The only Thunderbolt we have ever actually owned is the N model that's out in California being restored now.
Okay, so that's one myth down. I think we'll go through several before the end. So the other thing is the Commemorative Air Force, which used to be the Confederate Air Force, is founded. The mission is very serious, but the members are very playful. So it's a very serious organization, and we consider, you know, the work that we do extremely important. But we're also known for having a little fun, and there's some inside jokes there. So Gilbert, if you can put it on the next slide with, we call him Jethro Culpepper. So Brad, can you explain who is Jethro Culpepper? How did that come to be? What's the deal?
Well, when the CAF was formed in 1957, you know, there was 5 guys and 1 airplane. And they all showed up one morning to fly the Mustang, which is, you know, red nose. They all showed up to fly the airplane one morning, and somebody had painted Confederate Air Force underneath the stabilizer. And it absolutely meant nothing about the Confederacy. What it was about was the CAF, the members had already seen the kind of trouble they had acquiring just 1 Mustang. And then they were looking for other airplanes, and they saw that the U.S. government's policy was not to preserve these airplanes. Their policy was to destroy these airplanes, melt them down, get them out of the way. And so it kind of started out as a joke, as they were rebelling against the government's policy of destroying the planes. That's where the whole Confederate Air Force thing came. Well, when they walked out to the plane that morning in 57 and saw Confederate Air Force painted underneath the tail, as the story goes, they all saluted each other, and 2 of them declared themselves colonels and everybody else a sergeant right off the bat. And then they all had a heated discussion. I'm sure it was a fun discussion, but they decided nobody should be a sergeant. Everyone should all be 1 rank. That way nobody's in charge. Nobody has to get blamed for anything. No one's responsible for anything. That's kind of what the idea was. And the one misconception about the CAF is, you know, it was never intended to be 10,000 members and 170 airplanes. It was intended to be 5 guys in 1 airplane, and that is all it was ever intended to be. Well, as it started growing a little bit, you know, 1958, they bought 2 Bearcats, literally because somebody said, you know, the Bearcat's a better airplane than the Mustang. Well, the only way to prove this is to race them. So they went and got 2 Bearcats, and they got 2 because it was cheap to buy 2 Bearcats. And the thought was they would sell one to finance the second Bearcat. Well, they never did. They kept the 2 Bearcats for a long time. Well, now they had, 3 airplanes and 7 members. And then a couple of years later, they incorporated and everything like that. I think it was in 61. And they said that they wanted to keep the fun in the organization. And they wanted it to remain lighthearted but serious. And you have to remember, at the time, these airplanes weren't worth the millions of dollars that they are. Mustangs were $2,500 a piece and stuff like that. And so they created Jethro Culpeper strictly as a mythical leader of the organization. That way, nobody was really in charge. There was a mythical guy in charge of the whole thing, and then the executive director was actually the boss, and then you had the general staff and everything. Well, Culpeper, it was a joke. That's what the whole thing was, and this is where people get confused on the history of the CAF and the Confederate name and all that. The whole thing was intended to be a joke, and the idea of Culpeper just seemed funny to him. We've got this commander. It's got a real Southern name. Really sounds like some old, gentleman plantation owner or whatever. And you can see the progression of the different drawings they had and what they finally decided on. The whole purpose of him was to give a mythical figurehead to kind of show the fun of what they were doing and keep the fun instilled in it. And, Culpeper's still around. People don't refer to him the way they used to. One of the things that I have in my collection is a rubber stamp that I bought from a lady who used to be a secretary at headquarters in Harlingen. It's a rubber stamp they used to stamp Colonel Culpeper's signature on letters. Whenever people would write a letter to Colonel Culpeper, Nancy Malden or one of the ladies down there would write a response and would put the rubber stamp with Jethro E. Culpeper's signature. And the reason we got away from talking about Culpeper a lot in the daily operations is people were kind of mad when they would call headquarters to talk to Colonel Culpeper, and the standard answer was he's up in the Pentagon right now he's up in DC trying to get the Pentagon turned to face south, is what the standard answer was. And that was a joke too. Well, as the years went by and the CAF got to be a bigger business and more important and everything like that, they kind of did away with Culpeper in the daily operations because people were getting offended when they called and found out that he really didn't exist. They felt like they'd been fooled, and the joke was no longer funny to people outside of the organization. So he's still there. He's still the mythical leader, but he kind of came about as a joke, like a lot of things in the CAF's early history. It was intended to be fun, and it just has hung on all these years.
That makes sense. Gilbert, you want to go to the next slide? The next question is a pretty big question, which is what happened? How did it go from being, a couple of guys, a good old boys flying club to, a 10,000 member, education organization responsible for 170 airplanes? I mean, that's a big, it's a big leap.
Well, it's like I said in the beginning, when the CAF started, nobody else was really doing this. That was really the only flying museum on, this side of the Rocky Mountains. And as they got invited to do their first air show there for the Navy with just the Bearcat and the Mustang. And then they found out, they're like, oh, people really like seeing these airplanes fly. If we can get a couple of other guys involved, we can afford to buy more of these airplanes. We got to get them before the government melts all of them down. So if we get a few more people, let's get a few more airplanes. Well, I think by 1961, when they were incorporated as a tax-free charity, the limit was 500 people. That's all they would allow in the CAF. And they did that because they wanted to kind of maintain control. They wanted people who actually contributed. They wanted people who would come work on the planes and fly on the airplanes. Well, 10 years into their existence, they had, 10 airplanes. And they said, well, we'll stop right here. We'll stop with the 10 fighters and, the 100 members we have or whatever, and we'll be happy here. Well, they were doing, 6 or 7 air shows a year, at this time, because there just wasn't as many air shows back then. They're doing 6 or 7 air shows at a time in a season. And somebody comes up and says, well, you really ought to have a B-17. Well, you really ought to have a B-25 or whatever. And so they've got a B-25 just so they could kind of have a bomber to escort around with the fighters. And then somebody said, well, the A-26 is a better bomber than the B-25. Well, we better get one of those. And so it just kind of grew incrementally. And as they became, you have to remember, they were known in South Texas. That was where the CAF was known. And I think it was probably 1970, 71 when they started expanding beyond Texas as far as national membership and wings and squadrons. Up in Minnesota, I think was the first squadron or wing, and then New Mexico and Louisiana, they started branching out. And for up until the 80s, they were still the only people who were in this business. And so they were kind of victims of their own success, I guess. They just got bigger and it took more to run it, took more money, and then the planes got more valuable. They got more expensive to operate. There came a different clientele to join the CAF. Originally, it was a bunch of crop dusters and farmers and former military pilots. And then by the 80s and 90s, it was not necessarily that same breed of people. It was more, wealthy people, wealthy individuals who had the money to buy these kind of airplanes on their own. And they would rather operate ours than have to buy one of theirs. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it kind of changed the clientele that came in. So it just was a victim of its own success. It got bigger because it got more well known, and it grew outside of the U.S. And then when they went to Transpose 72, it's carried 25 airplanes or whatever it was up to Washington D.C. in 1972 for that big transportation conference. That is really when the CAF got national coverage. They were on NBC Nightly News. They were in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and all that. Prior to that, no one outside of the airplane world had heard of the CAF. And so in 1972, it started growing by leaps and bounds just because of the national exposure. And today, Steve Brown started the thing several years ago where he said the CAF, the Air Force you've never heard of, or something to that effect. And what had kind of happened was over the years, people knew who the CAF was if they were airplane people. But there were so many other organizations that operated planes and stuff like that the CAF hadn't lost any of their national prominence. They lost a little bit of the national visibility. And that's one of the good things that came out of that is the CAF became well known again. And we're back up to where we are the premier warbird operating organization in the world, really, but definitely in the country.
Yeah, it's a long history. Gilbert, do you want to go to the next slide? Now, there are pictures that we have, and you have a lot of them. There's pictures that we have of people who we know are important, but we don't really know who they are or what's going on or anything like that. And there's a picture coming up. But who are some of the people that you can think of, the famous people that have kind of come in and out of the CAF?
Well, that's Adolf Galland, the German fighter race is sitting right there in the center of that picture. He was a member. Pete Townsend, the British fighter race, the same time frame that Galland was. He was a member. Tom Landry, who was the coach of the Dallas Cowboys, he was a member. Paul Tibbets, who flew the Enola Gay. George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. G. Gordon Liddy, if you remember, one of the guys when Nixon and the Watergate scandal and all that happened. G. Gordon Liddy was one of the guys who went to prison over breaking into the Watergate Hotel. He was a CAF member later in life. He was not one of ours when he did the break-in, but later in life, G. Gordon Liddy was a member. There's Lord Mountbatten, Prince Philip over in England. They're members, honorary members of the CAF. Paul Ramsey was, the chief of naval operations. He was. Deke Slayton, one of the, all the original, 7 astronauts, I think all but one of them were all honorary members. Fred Hayes was, Apollo 13. Fred Hayes used to fly for Tora. Joe Engle, who flew the X-15 3 times and flew the space shuttle. He flew the P-40 in the CF and is still a member today. So it's been, a lot of people that are famous because of World War II, famous because of history. And then there are some people who are famous because of the CAF. If you think of Lefty Gardner, Lefty Gardner is one of the most well-known aviators in the history of aviation. Everybody knew his P-38 White Lightning. Everybody knew who he was, even if they'd never met him. Lefty Gardner was known because of the CAF. That's where he got his warbird start. I mean, he flew bombers in the war, but his warbird life started in 1961 with the CAF. So he's one of the famous guys that just from an air show perspective, that is a member of the organization or was a member of the organization.
So the next slide, now this is a very mythical story, and I'm hoping you could shed some light on it. There's a rumor that during Vietnam, the CAF had a Vietnam branch, a military branch.
Mm-hmm.
I found just a couple of pictures, but it really doesn't explain what it is or what we did during Vietnam. So can you tell us about that?
If you're talking about the guys that had the Hueys, yeah, right there, they had C model Hueys, and what it was, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was a CAF member who went to Vietnam with the Army, flying Hueys, and I don't know if he wrote a letter to Lloyd or what, but somehow or another, he got a picture to Lloyd of, the rebel flag on the front and him wearing his CAF gray Stetson and everything like that. And his unit, I don't think ever really had anything to do with the CAF. One or two of the individual members did, but they kind of sucked the rest of their squadron or their unit into what they were doing. The rest of the guys, I don't think were ever really members. It was never anything official with the CAF. It was simply this one unit with a couple of CAF members in Vietnam put the logo and the stickers and everything on their helicopters, and they did fly. I've looked through the records that I got access to, and I found a couple of names, but I can't find anything other than the CAF just kind of used this as an opportunity to say we support the military guys, the guys who are in Vietnam. That's really what I think the intent was. A couple of members were excited about it to bring the CAF over there, I guess you would say. And the CAF thought it was a good idea to show support for their members and for the military who was in Vietnam at that time. That's really what I believe it was about, but I've never got a real definitive answer on that.
So that's something, if anybody out there knows about that, let us know. So we're still looking for info there. On the next slide, Gilbert, the next slide is about Texas Raiders, and you had found what I believe is a telegram how the CAF acquired Texas Raiders that you have. What are some interesting, I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but what are some interesting, how the CAF acquired this airplane stories that you know?
How did the CAF acquire Texas Raiders? They
right. Where did they come from? Governments or what?
Yeah. Well, Texas Raiders was being used as an aerial survey airplane, and they wanted the airplane, and there was a couple of other B-17s available. And this particular one was in good shape, had a lot of spares and all that. And more importantly, they were willing to sell it, because you have to remember at the time, B-17s were still being used for firebombing and bug spraying and aerial surveying. And even down in South America, they were hauling meat in the back of two B-17s down in Colombia. And the CAF managed to buy Texas Raiders with, they always refer to, you'll see a lot of times listed in old history of the CAF, a very sympathetic banker. And it was a guy, Shelley Collier was his name. He was a guy who ran a Mercedes National Bank, or First National Bank of Mercedes. He was Lloyd Nolan's personal banker in his crop dusting business. And when they told him, they said, we found this B-17 we want to buy, and this is the first 4-engine bomber that the CAF was going to buy. He basically, he helped them get a loan, I guess is the easiest way to say it. And the CAF got a bunch of members to pitch in $350 a piece. And Gary Levitz of the Levitz Furniture Store chain, which is very prominent here in the DFW area, Gary Levitz was kind of the guy he was a young guy at the time. He took the reins and started raising all this money and getting all these members to put up the cash to pay the bank loan off to buy the airplane. So what the CAF did was they got Texas Raiders, but they got it with the understanding that it could be leased back to this aerial survey company for their use, because they still needed it, but they didn't need it bad enough to hold on to it full time. So the CAF got the airplane, and it did go back and get used one or two times. And the last time they were going to use it for aerial survey, it was supposed to go to Saudi Arabia, I believe, like Dhahran, to be used as a aerial survey airplane. And this stayed in operation until the loan was paid off. And so the CAF managed to pay off the loan and get the airplane back before it had to go to Saudi Arabia as an aerial survey airplane. But a lot of these airplanes, Texas Raiders was the first B-17 to be a warbird. It was the first B-17 purchased to be a air show plane. And there was another airplane. If you ever go to Dice Air Force Base over in Abilene, there's a B-17 sitting there now that at the time was sitting over at Abilene Regional Airport. And the city of Abilene was going to give that to the CAF. And it was basically a flyable plane. It had just been sitting for a long time. And that was very close to happening. Rather than spending money on Texas Raiders, they're going to get given this other airplane. And some of the city council decided they didn't want to get rid of the plane. So that option went away. That airplane got its wings cut off and it got carried under a helicopter over to Dice Air Force Base, reassembled, and it's still sitting there today. You can still see the cut marks. I've actually seen pictures of it flying across town, slung underneath the sky crane. And we ended up with Texas Raiders, and it flew until I believe it was 71 or 71. It flew in civilian colors until then, when it was finally repainted in military colors. The Gulf Coast Wing, I've helped them quite a bit here in the last several months on doing a real in-depth history of Texas Raiders and where it came from and how they got it. And I helped them. They've got a really good webinar that they did on it. They know far more about the history of the airplane than I did. But I did find that telegram for that and for the B-24 and several other airplanes. And some have some of that original CAF humor that was so famous. A lot of that was incorporated into those telegrams. But that's kind of a neat souvenir to have, because it's something no one even knows about anymore. Who knows anything about telegrams, So it's kind of neat to have those.
Do you know which of the CAF aircraft had any combat experience?
It seems to me like two airplanes do, but I cannot remember for the life of me what they are. Fifi doesn't, Diamond Hill doesn't, and I think Sentimental Journey may have been deployed right at the end of the war, but I don't think it actually got into combat. I really don't remember. I think there's two that do. I just don't know what it is.
Yeah, I think Miss Mitchell, the B-25 Miss Mitchell, is one of them.
Miss Mitchell is the sister ship to one of the B-25s we have here at Cavanaugh that is a combat veteran, and ours is still in its original paint with the original nose art and all that kind of stuff on it. And Miss Mitchell and that airplane were sisters. So I bet that's the truth. I bet it was Miss Mitchell's one of the combat veterans. I just can't remember for certain.
The next slide over, if you'll slide over, this is one of those pictures again with people, and we're not quite sure what's happening in the photo that's coming up, but I think it's Prince Philip. And so how did Prince Philip get involved?
Prince Philip, I don't remember what year it was, 74, 75, something like that. He was in Brownsville, and I don't know what he was doing. He was in the Royal Airplane or whatever, and he was in Brownsville, and the CAF found out about it, and it was during the air show in October. And so they took all the airplanes they had that had any British markings or had been used by the British, and they got all the members they could find that had accents, and they all went over to Brownsville and waited for Prince Philip to show up. And whenever his plane landed, this Royal Air Force plane, when it landed, he saw all these warbirds lined up over there and all these guys in their Confederate Air Force uniforms all lined up at attention waiting. And so he got off the plane and went over there and met him and got to talking to him and looked at all the airplanes and everything. And there was one guy, I can't remember his name, but there was one guy who had a real British accent. And I think his name is Gary Wolfe. He had a very British accent. He was kind of the tour guide and took him around and introduced him to everybody. And he was a pilot. Prince Philip's a pilot in real life. A lot of people don't know that. But his schedule didn't allow him time to come to the air show. He would have liked to, but he was on some kind of official business. So they did a low pass down the runway at Harlingen with his airplane, with all the CF fighters, the P-40, the Sea Fury, the Spitfire, and a couple others, all in formation with him. And then they wrote him a letter and offered him honorary membership, which he accepted. And Douglas Bader, the famous British ace in World War II, went and presented his credentials to him. And there was a picture in the dispatch back in the early 80s of Prince Philip and Douglas Bader standing there holding his CAF patch. And he's still a member. And every once in a while, back in the early, up to the mid-90s, I guess, he would be invited to events. And, one of the things that I've got is a couple of the things from his office saying that unable to attend due to his due to his travel schedule. But he apparently in the early days of his membership, he read the magazine and responded to letters when people wrote him and was very interested in what we did. Had he been living over here instead of over there, he probably would have been a really big supporter.
That's awesome. All right. The next question came from somebody about, Gilbert, if you'll go to the next slide, about the history of the CAF badges and insignia. So I pulled a couple of different badges that I could find that the CAF has used through the years to see if you have any background knowledge of them. One of the patches that'll be up here in a minute, there you go, is Culpepper's Angels. So maybe you can start with that whole story.
In the earlier days of the CAF, women were actually, I believe it was 1967, women were permanently barred from membership in the CAF. It was a vote with the general staff that women were not allowed. And the reasoning behind it, from what I saw in this file that I had about it, the reasoning behind it was every time they would be out at the hangar getting ready to fly airplanes and all that, if somebody brought their wife along, inevitably their wife made them leave, made them go do other things or whatever, and it was getting in the way. And so they said, well, we'll just fix this. It's kind of like a motorcycle club, no women allowed to ride or whatever. That's what the CAF did. So a lot of these wives got together and started the Culpepper's Angels, which is kind of the ladies' auxiliaries. And if you grew up in a small town like I did, where you have volunteer fire departments and stuff like that, a lot of them will have ladies' auxiliaries that what they do is they just help with some of the work that the men aren't doing because they're fighting fires. That's kind of what the Culpepper's Angels did. They provided refreshments and shade and did the paperwork at air shows and stuff like that. Well, the ban only lasted about 18 months, and then the ban quietly went away. And now we've had ladies on the general staff and everything else, and like everywhere else in the world, it's not shocking to see a lady in the CAF anymore. Back then it was. The Angels, it's not around anymore. I don't know that it ever officially disbanded, or if I know when Lynn Starkey she kind of gave up on running it just because of locality more than anything. It just kind of died off. But they were a very important part. And you look back in a lot of the early pictures of the CAFs from the 70s and all that, you'll see the Culpepper's Angels in every event that the CAF ever had anything to do with. You'll see the Culpepper's Angels being associated with it. The CAF Aviator flag on the left side, that's probably the most famous CAF patch anyone has ever seen, because those are very well known. There were different versions of them. Some of them had the Confederate flag with the U.S. flag. Some had the U.S. flag and the Texas flag. One had the Nevada flag. One was the shape of Nevada with that whole mint julep story in there. One had the California flag and the Texas or the U.S. flag. The funny thing is in 1967, I believe it was, I have a letter from Lefty and Lloyd that they wrote to the general staff saying that the Confederate flag and the Confederate name of the organization was not going to play outside of the Rio Grande Valley, that the joke had kind of run its course and the CAF was getting to be a national enough organization that they probably needed to give serious thought to changing everything. Well, it just kind of didn't happen for a long time. But in 1972, when Transpo 72 came up, one of the rules that went out was that you could not wear a Confederate flag anywhere on your uniform. You could have the Texas flag, but you had to have the U.S. flag. They said the back patches weren't allowed to be worn. In fact, I've got the one of the things I have, this is all the clothing rules for Transpo 72. And one of the things is nothing on the back of your uniform, no Confederate flags at all. We want people to understand this is an American organization. This is a United States of America organization, and we don't have time to explain the joke. And so that's where that back patch went. It kind of fell out of favor. Prior to that, there was a really big oval that had the Confederate flag in the middle that just said Ghost Squadron. And you'll see those for sale every once in a while. They're like really embroidered, really fancy embroidery and all that. But all these different patches just kind of, the one right below the Culpepper's Angel patch, I believe that one was actually authorized in 1967. And that was when it became the official patch. And it's pretty much been that same patch all these years. The big difference is there in the center where the star is. There's 3 versions of that patch. One has the Confederate flag, one has the U.S. flag, and then the one has the Army Air Corps symbol right there. And that's the one that is really known today. All the others, like the one on the right, that was the one that was originally for they had jackets, like dinner jackets that were part of your uniform, a black jacket. And that patch was the one that went on the pocket of it. They also went on some of the hats. The one on the upper right is a copy of the one that originally said Confederate Air Force. And that was just that was not an official CAF patch. That was one you sold to the tourists or whatever. The one in the center there on the bottom was the official, you had to be a colonel to own that patch kind of thing. So that's kind of that one. You know, the wings are another thing. There's been, up until about 1965, these are the wings that they had. They had the Confederate flag in the middle of them. I know it's a little hard to see. And at the top, it says Semper Mint Julep. Well, that was part of the humor of the CAF. And at the end of 1965, the wing stayed the same, except up at the top where it said Semper Mint Julep, they changed that to where it said Flying Museum. And it stayed that way until 1972, like towards the end of 72. And they made this style, which did away with the Confederate flag. It has the American flag in the middle, and it just says Ghost Squadron on the top of it. That stayed that way until 1975, roughly, when they went to this style, which is the same one that we have today. You know, it just has the shield with the 3 airplanes in the middle of it. Those are the 3 main wings that the CF had. There was one that was kind of a little different shape than that was on the hats. It was different because the way these were built, they didn't show up well on the hats, so they had kind of a wreath around them or whatever. But I don't know who made those. I don't know that there was ever any company that was the official CAF vendor for these kind of things, because if you look in the old catalogs from the late 60s, when they'd send out this price list and everything, it showed the ads. It never told where they were made. You just ordered them from the PX there in Harlingen. And I've got a bunch of their records somewhere, but I've never actually gone through and looked at the invoices. I ought to do that someday and figure out, you know, which one came from where, just because.
So, Gilbert, if you want to go to the next slide, members of the CAF know that the CAF is very big on awards. And annually, we give several awards throughout the year, but there's one award that many people don't know about. There's only one. It sits in the office. It's not something that's in every CAF location. But can you tell us what this award is about?
This was the Distinguished Order of the Brass Jackass. And what this was an award that was given for a person who did the most ridiculous thing in a CAF airplane. That's essentially what it boiled down to. A guy named John Houston, he was doing his T6 checkout, and he ground looped twice in both directions on the same landing and wound up taxiing back the wrong direction. And so he got the Brass Jackass. You know, Lefty Gardner, I think he was the one that taxied over a trash can. It didn't hurt nothing, just hit it with a wing and ran over the trash can, and everybody's waving, and he just kept waving back and kept taxiing, dragging the trash can behind him. So he got the Brass Jackass. The award, a few years ago, we made a duplicate of it. There at headquarters, we got a duplicate and made it because the original one has disappeared at some point. I think I may know where it's at, but I haven't got them to confess yet, because if I could find it, I'd buy it from them. But what this award didn't travel, it stayed at headquarters, and you just got a nameplate on it. There were a few awards that they gave out that you got to keep for the year, then you had to give back. Well, the Brass Jackass was prominently displayed in the Officers Club in Harlingen. And, you know, they didn't put people on it for getting, you know, destroying airplanes or anything like that. It was for stupid mistakes that nobody got hurt, nothing really got damaged. So it was kind of if you read the names of the people who have been given the Brass Jackass, it's a who's who in the warbird world, because there are some very prominent people and some, you know, Hall of Fame members and stuff like that. I don't want to say it's an honor to receive the Brass Jackass Award, but it would be an honor to be included amongst that group of people, because it's a pretty eclectic group. I don't know if we'll ever give the Brass Jackass Award again. That's one of those things that was kind of one of the Brass Jackass Awards in 1972 went to Vernon Thorpe. And Vernon, unfortunately, died in the Marauder crash, but Vernon flew everything the CAF ever had. And he flew the Messerschmitt for his very first time. He didn't want to fly it, but Carl Payne and somebody else, Gerald Martin, that were supposed to fly it, neither were available, and it had to be somewhere for something. So they just checked him out in it and said, go fly it. And he came back and he blew one tire and went off the side of the runway and blew the other tire, but managed to get the plane stopped. But they said it was pretty comical just to watch him try to get the airplane under control because he was just along for the ride. Well, Lloyd Nolan wrote his citation for the Brass Jackass, and somebody that was on the general staff at the time got offended. And this was in 72. They said, he almost hurt the airplane, and we shouldn't be praising someone for doing this. And Lloyd wrote, I've got the letter right here. He wrote this 2-page letter basically saying that anyone who had ever flown the Messerschmitt and survived was lucky. And the fact that he had done this landing and made it so comical and got out of the airplane and acted like nothing happened, he goes, that's what's funny about this. And the last paragraph in this letter, he goes, we've got to try to keep some of the fun and fellowship and foolishness and to keep the spirit up in this organization. Best regards, Lloyd Nolan. So in 1972, Lloyd Nolan was already starting to see that some of the fun of this was going away. And I think the Brass Jackass, it wasn't a victim then, but later it came a victim of, well, it's not funny to, be happy for people who made accidents and mistakes. That wasn't the intent of the award. And I personally think it should be brought back and given every year.
So the next slide that we have is from someone sent it in, and it's a photo that they have of Diamond Lil, and he thinks it's from the 1992 tour in the UK, and he's interested in knowing if it's from the Diamond Lil tour and who are the people who signed it.
I do believe that is from the Diamond Lil tour in 92. I don't, a lot of the people that went with the airplane to the UK, not all of them went on the plane. A lot of them traveled over there commercial or whatever. I don't remember who all flew it over and who didn't, but Vic Hughes down there on the bottom left, he was on the airplane going across. Sam Mangrum up there on the top left. Ray Crottinger over there right above the tail fin. He was one of the pilots that went along on the trip. So I do believe that is from that 1992 tour. One of the things I have somewhere in this pile is all the navigation and maintenance logs from that entire trip, from the time they left Fort Worth until they got back. And it has the list of all the people. I tried to find it the other day, and I just can't lay my hands on it. But I do recognize a lot of those names from that trip. And oddly, I don't think any of those people are actually still involved with the airplane. It kind of shows how time marches on. I don't believe any of them are still. Some of them are still around. I know Ray's still around. I see him once in a while, but none of those people, fly on the airplane anymore, unfortunately. But yes, I do believe that is from the 92 trip to the UK.
Very cool.
Great. I think we are ready to take some questions from the audience. So Gilbert, if you want to check out what's going on in the questions panel and ask away.
Yeah, definitely. So Howard Iran, his first question is, how did the CAF get any footage of the Heinkel HE-111 that is used to own, and did they ever own and fly a Junkers? And it would be good to see images and footage of older CAF planes in some sort of member archives.
The Heinkel, there's a lot of footage of the Heinkel. In fact, there's actually footage from Air Show 78 of the Heinkel that the CAF had at the time and the Heinkel that the Cavanaugh Museum still has. And they were flying in formation, and that was in 1978, and that's the last time that ever happened because the Cavanaugh plane went to a different owner. But the CF, there's a lot of footage of that all through the 80s and early 90s. It flew at every air show down in Harlingen, and it came to Midland many times. And so there's a lot of footage of it when it was painted green and when it was painted in desert colors. Unfortunately, it was lost in an accident in Cheyenne, Wyoming. But there's a lot of footage of that. A lot of real. In fact, if you were at the Hall of Fame banquet last year, there's a good picture of Ronnie Gardner that was taken by Bill Crump. A good picture of Ronnie Gardner flying the Heinkel, and it's actually aiming down on the airplane where you can see the crew looking up through the top of the plane at the camera. We did own a Ju-52 for several years. It flew with the Heinkel a lot. It toured the country. It was up in Michigan for many years with the squadron up there. And what happened with the Heinkel is, you know, foreign built airplanes and experimental foreign built airplanes can't be used for the RIDE program here in the U.S. And unfortunately, the Ju-52, being a foreign built airplane, it was actually a Spanish built airplane. They couldn't do rides in it. They couldn't sell rides. And it's a big, expensive airplane to own, and it takes a lot of space. And they had the airport authority that owned the airport where they had it at. They didn't like the fact that there was what they call a Nazi bomber sitting on their ramp. And so the airplane, even though it wasn't a Nazi plane and it wasn't a bomber anyway, but anyway, it wound up in Midland at headquarters, and they tried to reassign it to other units because they just couldn't make enough money with it to keep the airplane. And it just never happened. And the airplane ended up being sold like a few other airplanes did, because there was no way to, you know, unfortunately, no Bucks, no Buck Rogers. That's just the way it is. If we can't make enough money to keep the airplanes flying, you can't fly them. And there was no money for that Ju-52. Sadly, it would have been nice to keep, but it just, it wasn't a practical thing to do. There are a lot of pictures and videos of both airplanes. You don't see them a lot nowadays because there tends to be I don't know, we don't show a lot of pictures of planes that we don't have anymore because it makes some people sad. It causes a lot of questions. Well, why do you can't just tell people we had to sell this because it's a business decision. That's not a good enough answer. They want details, and sometimes there is no details. And so sometimes I think we tend to not show the airplanes that we used to own, or especially the ones that were lost in tragic accidents, because it's just too sad to look at. But there are pictures, and you know, if you maybe we can try to put some more pictures up once in a while of old airplanes. I usually put up pictures that I've got from before we bought the airplane, or when we barely had the airplane or whatever. And then I posted a few pictures of like the Heinkel and stuff like that. But they're out there if you look for them. I guess we just never thought about how many people would really wanted to see the pictures of stuff that we have owned rather than what we do own.
Right. Okay, awesome. Next question is from Hans Christian Andersen. Why were the original uniforms gray? Any connection with historical developments, and why was the original name the Confederate Air Force?
Well, as I kind of touched on at the very beginning, the Confederate Air Force was a joke because the name was done as a joke because they were these very small group of guys were rebelling against the U.S. government's policy of destroying all these World War II airplanes. It had nothing to do with the Confederacy. It was simply because they were rebelling against the government's policy. They were all from the South. They all lived in South Texas. They were all farmers and crop dusters, and it was just a joke. The gray uniforms and a lot of the early humor and heraldry and everything of the CAF was all gray because of the name Confederate Air Force, but it literally never had anything to do with the Confederacy, not in the slightest. And sometimes, our tendency now is whenever we talk about, when the name changed, it was voted on by the membership and everything. And we tend to just say, well, the reason it was done was it no longer reflected the mission of the organization. And that's true. That's 100% true. But I sometimes think we ought to do a better job of explaining the reasoning behind the original name, because sometimes that gets lost. If you ever look at the CAF's Facebook page, there's a lot of the comments on there from people going, well, Confederacy never even owned airplanes. They don't get it. It was a joke. That's all it was a joke. And they knew by 1964 and 1967 that it was a bad joke that wasn't going to work anymore in a national organization. But it was all done for fun. Had nothing to do with the Civil War, had nothing to do with the Confederacy, other than it was a group of guys rebelling against the government's policy of destroying the airplanes. The gray uniforms, I'm sure gray was picked because it was Confederate gray or Union blue. I'm sure that's the reason that it happened, but I've never actually seen that in writing. But with everything else they did, it was all based off of the Old South, and I'm sure that's why they did it that way.
Yeah, that makes sense, Brad. Next question. Is there a number of legacy 172 scale Confederate Air Force diecast models of planes from Corgi? Is there any plans from Commemorative Air Force to produce a up-to-date range of Corgi diecast models?
Leah will know that better than me, but that kind of question comes up pretty often. And it comes up with everything from that to model decals to shirts with our planes pictures on them and all that. And things like that, you have to buy a lot of them and sell a lot of them to make money. And
Correct.
There was a big group of the Corgi airplanes, and you still find a whole lot of them in the original package that never really sold. And so, like I said, Leah can answer better than me. I don't know that we would do something like that from a financial perspective. You would have to sell a whole lot of those airplanes to make it worth the production cost.
Yeah, and Brad has it right. There's so many things that the CAF can do and wants to do. I mean, in any given day, the ideas we have of things that we could create and film. And, one of the things that somebody brought it up is one of the things that we've wanted to do for a long time is to take all of the images that Brad has and that we have and just scan them all. And so that we can, look at them or even post them online so that people can help explain who's in the picture, what's going on, because a lot of that information has been lost through the years. But so many of those projects fall into the category of, we want to do it, is there enough money and is there enough time to do it? And that's pretty much the reason. It's not a very good excuse because we know how well it would be received, but sometimes we have to just focus on what our mission is, and it takes us in a different direction. But we've talked to Corgi before about doing something, and we're more likely, I think, to work with a model company and have them sell the models than we are creating our own models, because we're not in the model business. So I hope that answers that question.
Yep. Next question is from Howard again. Thank you, Howard. Last year, we visited Texas from the UK. We went to Houston Lone Star Aircraft Museum. There were some references to Lloyd Nolan there, but no CAF presence. Has the CAF have ever been based in Ellington Field, and what is the Lloyd Nolan connection? Are there any CAF planes there?
This other thing, Leah lives in Houston. She'll know better than me. But yes, the CAF has had airplanes at Ellington over the years. That's Texas Raiders is in Conroe, which is in Texas terms, that's not far away. 100 miles is not a long way. 40 miles is not a long way. So in that area, yes, there is CAF assets. The Lloyd Nolan connection is Lloyd Nolan was inducted into the Texas Aviation Hall of Fame. And of course, Lloyd is the guy who started the CAF. He is the guy who originally owned a P-40 Warhawk and then sold it to buy a Mustang. He had been an instructor pilot during the war and had never gotten to fly fighters. So he sold the P-40 to buy the Mustang. And then this is in 1952, they all got recalled into the military for the Korean War. And so he wasn't able to get another Mustang till 1957, which is where he did it with 4 other guys, and that's where the CAF started. So that's what the Lloyd Nolan connection is. He's a member of the Texas Aviation Hall of Fame. That's why his picture and plaque and all that and name are down there in Lone Star, which is an outstanding museum. By Lone Star Museum's outstanding.
It's very interesting. Thank you for answering that, Brad. Sean Broadhead. His question is, who was a pilot in the old photo of the original famous members?
I don't know. I don't know which picture that is. There's a couple of the pictures of the very early ones. There's like Lloyd Nolan, Lefty Gardner, Billy Dre, Connie Edwards, Gerald Martin. I would have Dick Disney. I would have to see the picture to be able to tell exactly which picture it is.
It's the first gentleman that you had mentioned, if that helps.
Oh, I done forgot who I mentioned. I done forgot who I actually mentioned. It just depends on the picture. There's a lot of pictures of the early CAF aviators.
Got it. And James Evans. Made in the Shade, B-25 at Air Base, Arizona, has 15 combat missions in 1944.
That I don't know. I don't know for certain. I don't recall that being an actual combat airplane. I think it's painted in those markings, maybe. I'm not 100% sure on that. Somebody from Arizona would know that better than me.
Well, Brad, I believe those are the last of the questions that I see.
Well, I just want to ask one question of Brad before he goes. And it's a tough question, I guess, is what have you gotten out of this organization? And what do you have to say to someone who is interested in the organization but doesn't quite know how to get involved or what they would do?
Well, I'll tell you exactly what I got out of it. I got the answer to a little kid's dream. The CAF is how I got. I mean, yes, I do warbirds for a living for another organization now, but the CAF is how I got started. The CAF is who gave a little kid the way into the door. If it wasn't for the CAF, I seriously doubt I would have the interest in aviation that I do, and particularly warbirds. So what I got out of it at the end of the day is exactly what I put into it. I put a lot of work into it, a lot of effort and a lot of time, and I've gotten greatly rewarded by it. I was a flight engineer on Fifi for a long time. I've flown on all these different airplanes, done a lot of cool stuff. That's all not because of who I am or anything like that. It's because I put the effort into it. And that's what the key to the CAF is. You get out what you put in. If you put nothing into it, you will get nothing out of it. If you just want a magazine every month, there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at all. And we love members who will donate money just to donate. But if you want to fly the airplanes, if you want to work on the airplanes, you have to go out and put up with the politics and put up with the whether it's a car club or old airplanes, you're going to have politics and personalities. You just have to hang around, because there's one thing that I used to say in the military: if you're in trouble on Friday, just wait until Monday, because someone got in trouble over the weekend and they won't even remember your name come Monday. Well, in the CAF and a lot of units, no one gets in trouble or nothing, but people leave. People come in. If you show up and you put in effort and you make yourself valuable, you will find yourself moving up in the organization or in the local organizations, the squadron. You'll find yourself getting out of this what you put into it. If all you do is sit around and whine and gripe, you're not going to get much out of it. But if you go in and make an effort to help and change things and contribute, my gosh, I can't describe the kind of rewarded life I've had. And 99% of it is because of the CAF, because of the opportunities the CAF has presented me. I'm forever grateful. But that's not just something that only Brad Pilgrim can do. Anybody can do this. If a little kid from Snyder, Texas can go be a flight engineer on a B-29, so can anybody else. I just happened to, I did that instead of doing other things. And I'll be forever grateful for the opportunity. So you get out of this what you put into it.
Well, thank you, Brad, so much. This has been awesome.
I have a few more questions that have just popped up.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Howard, thank you again for all your questions. I appreciate it, buddy. Has the CAF ever considered inducting Prince Harry into the organization, as H now resides in the U.S. and has Army flying career, and Prince Philip has now stood down from official royalty duties?
I don't know that I've never heard that mentioned. I don't know. That would have to be something that we'd have to have the general staff look into. See what he's contributed. What has he contributed to our kind of lifestyle, what we do, what we believe in, and how we do things. You don't induct people honorarily just because they got a name. They have to be a reason behind it. So I don't know. We can ask the general staff about that and see what happens. I'd never thought of that. That's a good question. It's a good
Very good question. And Brad, you kind of mentioned a little bit about this, but Claire Parr, she said, what did it take to become a CAF chief historian?
Nobody else was doing it, I guess. I mean, I just, when I was a kid, I was so impressed with these people who were doing this, who were flying these airplanes and running the organization. And the CAF, because of the way it started as a joke and all that, and then became this multinational, very successful business and all that, and so important in the world. There's so many little things that happen behind the scenes. And I just happened to be the one who wound up collecting everything, I guess is the easiest way to say it. And when I was a kid, I would ask questions, and I would sit around and listen to these guys talk as they argued after they came out of the general staff meetings and stuff like that. I would listen to them fight in the corner of the hangar about what had happened and what had gone on. And that's where I started picking things up and piecing things together. And another thing that I do that a lot of other people don't do, I go to the general staff meetings. Any member can go to the general staff meetings. And I make a point to do that. I make a point to do that because that is where you hear what is going on. And so I just picked it up over the years. Nobody else wanted to be the historian. And I just find the history of the organization, to me, is fascinating. It's just one big soap opera that has been very successful in spite of itself sometimes. And it still does something that nobody else does on a scale nobody else does. And I think this is easily the most important warbird organization in the country, education-wise, everything else. We're getting to the top of the pile where we will stay, and I'm glad to be associated. It's an honor to be a historian, official or not. So,
one thing I think is interesting is I don't have nearly the collection that Brad does, but I have pulled up some old air show brochures and things like that. And when you read the magazines from the 70s, 80s, 90s, 60s, it still rings true. You know, that's to me what is the most amazing is the organization this large has changed, you know, technology-wise, people have gone in and out, but the core mission of the organization through decades has been the same. And that is just, it's amazing to me that the CAF has held on to that, and is most definitely the secret to the longevity is just having a firm belief in the mission that the aircraft should be flown, that people will understand the history and appreciate it so much more when the aircraft are flying. And I think that's a pretty cool thing that we've got going on there.
One thing that I really, kind of the last thing I need to say, one thing that I really find fascinating going through the old records all the way from 57 up till now, nothing has changed. The problems, the personalities, the fights, the financial issues, you always need money, you always need something. Nothing has ever changed except the names and the dollar figures. Otherwise, the problems in 1957 are the same problems in 2020. It's names and dollar figures have changed. Otherwise, the struggle is the same. And I find that fascinating that it has not really changed. We are still succeeding at something that started as a fun time, and now it's the largest group in the world doing it. And I think that's just amazing. And I'm very proud to be part of that.
Awesome. And James Evans, he came back with the Maid of Shade question. Saying Maid of Shade flew 15 combat missions from Corsica in November to December 1944. It's still painted in the Battle 18, it's still painted as Battle 18, her wartime paint job. Okay,
that may be. I didn't know. I know that airplane, when it first came to the CAF, it was known as Big Old Brew and Little Old U. It was owned by a guy named Craig Timms, and it showed up here at headquarters in Midland. It had severe corrosion, and they had to borrow a wing off of another airplane, bring it down in the C-46, put it on this B-25 in order to even ferry it out to Arizona to do the restoration on it. One of those got the airplane thinking it was in better shape than it was, and it was a pig and a poke. He got it and went, ooh, wait a minute, this is not as great as we thought it was. But it's a gorgeous airplane now. I've ridden in it twice, I guess. It's a really nice airplane. And Arizona, like all the other wings, they do a great job with what they are trusted with. They do it exceptionally.
That's pretty cool, man. Another question from Hans. On the sad note, final note, you said Europe's best vintage World War II air show, Flying Legends, usually in July, will no longer happen at Duxford. Fighter Collection will be looking for alternative venue, finance COVID-19 to blame. And, it's a great sadness amongst devoted fans towards it.
It is. If they want to come to Texas, we'll find a place to put them. They've got the Fighter Collection's got a great collection, and Duxford was an outstanding place for an air show. Maybe they'll be able to come back from this. Maybe they'll be able to fix their problems and come back. Nobody wants anything bad to happen to anybody in this business. We're all we're all in the same struggle at the end of the day. So hopefully they work it out.
Yep. And then Duncan Iran, he said, when can we expect to see the revised hardback book of the history of the CAF, the legacy one of I have is showing its age?
Oh, if you only knew how many fights there have been over that over the years. The simple fact is books don't sell like they used to. And the cost of doing that right there, the cost of doing that is unbelievably large. I don't know that you'll ever see a hardback version. You may see digital versions of a book someday. It seems like it'd be a really easy thing to write, but when that book was written, headquarters had about 45 people on the staff. And we don't have that anymore at headquarters. And so you don't have a person to just sit and write. Now, one of the things I'm doing in my very limited spare time anymore is writing a book. I'm writing two, the history of the CAF, called The Greatest Story You've Never Heard. And then I'm writing another one just about the history of Fifi, where it came from and how the CF got the airplane. Now, the CAF history book's up to about 2,400 pages right now, because every time I think I'm nearly done, I find something else cool that fascinates me that nobody else would care about, but I think it's got to be included. So the chances of you ever getting it published is probably pretty slim, but I don't think you'll see another hardcover CAF book. That's just not the way the market works nowadays, sadly. Although I love books, people just don't buy them in the numbers that you would need to sell them.
Right.
That's been discussed at length over the last 5 or 6 years. That's come up many times.
Yep. And the last question from Howard and Duncan Iran, they really appreciate your webinar and appreciate from the folks here. And, they're from the UK. They just want to say thank you, and that it's an honor to wear the CAF Colonel Wing. And CAF is the most significant warbird movement in the world, not just the USA.
Well, we appreciate them being members and appreciate them tuning in to listen to this walk down memory lane that I do. I'm glad to actually tell somebody, because I keep talking to other people. They don't care. It's nice to talk to people who actually want to hear it. My parents always look, okay, how many more CF stories can we hear? So,
well, Brad, I feel like we've just scratched the surface here, and hopefully you'll come back again and we'll have another slew of mysteries to solve. So thank you once again. Thank you for joining us and for sharing your info. And thanks everybody for watching. Next week, we are going to take a break on Wednesday because it is the J Day. So it's Victory in Japan on September 2nd. And there are going to be lots and lots of live streamings, I am told. So if you check out the Commemorative Air Force website, which is commemorativeairforce.org, or the CAF Facebook page, we'll have links to some of those flyovers that are happening. We have aircraft that are in them. So, and I believe it will be throughout the day, everything from Hawaii to New York. So hopefully we'll see a lot of really good stuff there. And after that, on the 9th, we are welcoming the ICAF, which is the International Council of Air Shows, which is having a very difficult year. But they'll come in and they'll tell us about the history of air shows and why they're still important, and kind of what's going on with air shows these days, what we can expect to see in the future. So again, thank you all very much for attending, and we'll see you on September 9th. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a great one.